It's submitted. I finished the revise and resubmit a while ago. There was nothing technical criticism about the paper, just asking me to fill in some blanks on a couple of missing citations, references. So I have not looked at the paper for a long time. Had I known I was going to present the paper, I would have prepared and looked at the paper. So this is, I was somewhat rattled when I found out I'm supposed to present this paper, but let's move on. Let's see, okay. For the motivation, the success of China's reform, I think we don't need to discuss that. Everyone here knows with, probably better than I am. Couple of things that we all know: widespread corruption, damaging pollution, and extreme income inequality. I personally did not start research on China until after 2001. I am Chinese, but I was born and raised in Taiwan. So my understanding of China is somewhat limited, even though I'm interested. And I've always said I'm not a China specialist. I'm a student that is concerned and interested in learning about China. But in 2004, I already raised above questions listed up here in 2004, including my recommendation to the Chinese government in 2004 that they needed to start thinking about loosening the one-child policy. So I am proud to say, and probably pat myself on the back a little bit, I'm perhaps a little bit ahead of the curve in a lot of these things. This talk today is concerned about the income inequality. This is borrowed from Dean Gan Li from Southwest University of Finance and Economics. This is not about income, this is about wealth. So if you look at the median versus mean wealth in urban China, you can see the dramatic difference. And of course, for us, we immediately know it's not a standard, symmetric, normal distribution. If it was, the mean and the median would not be that dramatically different. And the question I have now is, this is urban. Do you think the rural area will be better or worse than the urban? I'm just curious. The answer is worse, if you look at it from a percentage point of view. The gap is even bigger. So that is the motivation and the focus of this paper. And with the current new normal that has increased even additional uncertainty and bewilderment somewhat, making the study of this perhaps even more important. And the key point is, if people deem society as unjust and feel upward social mobility is beyond their reach, then we could have social unrest, class conflict. So that is the point I would like to make and just want to focus on this question. Intergeneration mobility, we have some studies on that, and they've all found that intergeneration income mobility in China is low. Social mobility is low after the reform. Before the reform, China was very egalitarian. That was not an issue. So this became progressively worse with the deepening of China's reform, and I think nobody here would be surprised at this. Understanding the causal mechanism, that is a totally different issue. And I cited a major paper discussing that. The main point people want to discuss, and that's the focus of this paper, is to discuss this lack of income mobility. Is it due to human capital issue, or is it due to father-son income relationship? So that is what the focus, the central focus is. A little bit on the literature review, given that time is short. I will skip through most of these. Couple of things that are more interesting. If you look at it, the literature has found relatively low intergeneration income elasticity, IIE. In case, for those of you that are not very familiar, if you have a low intergeneration income elasticity, that translates to a relatively high social mobility. So having a low IIE is a good thing. And the literature has found in a lot of the high social welfare countries, Norway, Sweden, these countries, they tend to have low IIE, while for the other more advanced industrialized countries, the IIE are higher. Not high, higher. Studies on developing countries tend to be lacking. Why? Data. But whatever we have, they tend to be much higher. And of course, that should come as no surprise. Another strand of the literature looks at the underlying mechanism that causes this income correlation. These includes Becker, the grandfather at the founding of all labor economists. But the testing of these mechanisms in a rigorous manner has proven to be difficult, father and son, because there is genetics involved, too much unobservability. So some people have tried to use decomposition methods, but that really doesn't solve the problem. The other, and that's where this paper focuses on, falls in, is try to look at using econometric techniques to bypass this genetic unobservable. And that's where we fall under. And that there are two major strands. One is by Lefgren, the other is by Kardec. We chose Lefgren, and that's one of the things I had to clarify in the revise and resubmit, because the referee asked, why didn't you choose Kardec? The problem is Kardec, their method is quite sensitive to specification. That's why we felt Lefgren was more superior in that sense. So we followed Lefgren very closely. The bottom line is we are interested in the beta, the correlation or the relationship, elasticity if you may, between the father's income, YO, generation O, and the son's income, Y1. And of course, then you have your income that fluctuates around, current income fluctuates around permanent income with a random disturbance shock. I won't bore everyone with all the math. I have to follow my own advice. I always tell younger faculty and graduate students when they present, don't dwell too much on your math model because you do not have time. Those that already know the math, they don't need you to tell them. Those that don't know the math, they're not going to understand it in 5 minutes. So I have to sort of take my own advice, and I want to bypass as much as I can. This I do want to discuss a little bit because this is the key. If we use an instrumental variable to estimate the beta, if you look at it, we have a K. K, that's a scaling factor. I will discuss that and use that, refer this back later. And you have pi 1. Pi 1, if you recall, let's see if I can get it backwards. Pi 1, if you look at it, that's the father's income's effect on the son's income. Pi 2 is the father's human capital on the son's income. So these are the two main channels that we want to talk about. And if you look at it, the gut feeling is if your father is rich, and then you are rich, not because your father is educated. This is a sign of nepotism. Connections. So being able to decipher whether the channel is through pi 1 or pi 2, that is the critical and interesting thing that we are trying to do here. So getting back, K is a scale factor, I'll discuss that. So if you look at it, when you look at the IV estimate of the IIE, we have pi 1 plus pi 2 and highly complex covariance. So the Lefgren technique utilizes this. If you look at two different instrumental variables, methods to estimate beta, and you look at the difference, the pi 1 cancels out. What you are left with is the scale variable times pi 2 and this horrendous looking covariance. If the two instrumental variable estimates are the same. That means either pi 2 is equal to 0, or in the parentheses, in the bracket, that complex covariance is equal to 0, which is highly, highly unlikely. So if the two instrumental variables give you the same IIE estimates, then you are fairly confident to conclude that the human capital channel is negligible, meaning the inter-income generation is mainly through father's income to son's income. So that bypasses any of the unobservable genetic issues. This is what I mean using an econometric method to solve the issue. To preserve time, let me move quickly and look at the data. The data is the China Family Panel Studies from our host, Peking University. The sample selection, I'm a labor economist by trade, so I am always weary about sample selection bias. Heckman was technically my teacher, even though I never took his class. So sample selection bias, we all automatically think about Heckman. First of all, we can only choose samples with positive income. Otherwise, what's the point? So the first sample selection is we look at positive income. Second, we look at age between 20 and 60. And again, mainly in China, 60 is basically the mandatory retirement age. We also chose eldest son. In the US, this immediately raises a red flag. But for those that are familiar with China, we know by limiting to eldest son, it's not as big as a sample selection issue as it would be for most other countries. So we resulted in 671 pairs of father and son in our sample. This is the descriptive statistics, and I just wanted to look at, this shows improvement of our reform. If you look at the education level, for the father generation, the average education is about 6.75 years, while for the son generation, it's almost 3 years higher. And if you look at the income, the son's income is 9.29 compared to the father's of 9.19. Of course, this is a very, very low-end estimate. Let's not forget, are we looking at the early career of the son and the high income earning periods of the father? So this is a gross lower bound estimate of the improvement of income. The instruments, it depends critically. The instruments that we choose, it has to be highly correlated with the father's permanent income, but orthogonal to transitory shocks of both father and son's current income. These are the four that we chose. At least the referees agreed that these are acceptable. Lefgren, I think, only used 2 instrumental variables. We chose to do 4. These are the estimates. If you look at it, it ranges from 0.339. It's very consistent. And the over-identification test, we overwhelmingly confirm that they are equal. That the 4 beta estimates using the 4 instruments, the coefficients are the same. Meaning the main transition, the transmission channel is through father's income to son's income, and not the father's human capital to the son's income. And again, this raises concern because this is a signal and a gut instinct of nepotism, connections, that type of thing. To save time, let me move to this. This is the scale variable I mentioned earlier. The scale variable means your estimates could be underestimated by this fraction. So once we adjusted the IIE we presented in the earlier slide, once you adjust for this underestimation bias, you can see the IIE could go up as high as above 0.6 which is quite high, next, we wanted to do some robustness test, fairly standard. We cut out the top 0.5% and bottom 0.5% outliers. And again, if you look at it, it still overwhelmingly rejects the null hypothesis that the four estimates are different. So that we still confirm, or at least cannot reject, the contention that the main transmission of income is through father's income to son's income and not through the human capital. The next robustness test we looked at is look at the life cycle bias. What we did was, the original sample was looking at 20 to 60-year-old. Next, we limited to 21 year to 60, 22 to 60, and if you look at the p-value, they all remained fairly strong, except for the 25, when we limited to 25 years old. We still barely was able to reject, very barely. I'm not totally sure what's going on here. This is just what the data told me. So presenting it here. The next robustness test, what we did was, we allowed daughters. We added the daughters in, and if you look at it, not too surprisingly, it did not increase the sample size that large. Because these are basically younger, unmarried daughters that are still living with the father and the older brother. So the sample is relatively small. It does change the elasticity. The power is slightly lower, but still large enough to strongly reject that the coefficients are not equal. So the main result still remains the same. Quickly going to conclusions. I'm very proud of myself. I've never been able to finish on time. I think this is one of the rare conclusions. As we said, before the economic reform, China was a very, very egalitarian state. This is almost by definition. And things have become progressively bad. Our IIE estimates shows a lower bound of 0.339. After the underestimation adjustment, it reaches beyond 0.6. And here is the key concern. The primary causal effect is through paternal income and not human capital, which suggests nepotism or connection. Also, from a policy point of view, this high IIE suggests if the government takes action and improves income distribution, not only will that have an effect in the current generation, it'll have a panel effect, a trickle-down effect of affecting the next generation, the generation after that, and the generation after that. So I guess that's the positive side of a relatively high IIE. Not on this slide, but I would like to also show where my next research is going. This is based on the 2010 wave data. The 2015 wave data was just released last year. My co-authors and I, we are already cleaning the data, preparing for a second paper. And my gut instinct is that in the 2015 data, the IIE should be a bit lower. I call that the Xi effect, Xi Jinping effect. That would be something that we probably would expect from the anti-corruption. So I want to see that. And related to this is a little bit of advice to younger faculty and graduate students here who will be planning on joining our ranks as academia. When you do research, do not chase what is popular, firing a random shot here, doing a paper in this direction, a paper in that direction. What you need to do is to have a longer research interest, research plan. What I call try to grow a bunch of grapes. In my research, whenever I write a paper, I can easily cite my own work, 7, 8, 10 papers. Of course, I never do that, because if you do that, that will make the referee very angry. But still, you can cite yourself legitimately in a highly correlated reference of 3 to 4 papers. That establishes yourself as an authority. The agglomeration effect is also an increasing returns to scale for your citations. So I will conclude here with an advice to younger faculty and future academia on that point. Thank you.